We now transition into the pre-trial phase of criminal procedure. This critical stage encompasses all formal legal steps that occur after the initial arrest and the filing of charging documents, but crucially, before the actual trial commences. For examination purposes, especially the multi-state bar examination, understanding procedural variations is essential. Federal proceedings are strictly governed by the federal rules of criminal procedure, such as Rule 5 concerning initial appearances and Rule 6 addressing the grand jury. State rules often differ significantly, making this distinction vital for your studies. This introductory segment will set the stage for our deep dive into the three core components of this phase. First, we examine the grand jury system, followed by the formal arraignment where the defendant enters a plea, and finally, we analyze the rules surrounding pre-trial release, commonly known as bail. Transitioning now to our first core topic, the grand jury system, which is deeply rooted in American legal history. Constitutionally, its necessity is established by the Fifth Amendment. This amendment mandates that for any federal capital or infamous crime, a formal indictment must be returned by a grand jury before prosecution can commence. The grand jury serves a dual function. Primarily, it acts as an investigative body, often working closely with the prosecutor. More importantly, it functions as a critical shield, protecting citizens from unwarranted or politically motivated prosecutions initiated by the government. It is crucial to distinguish this body from the trial jury. While the trial jury determines guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, the grand jury only assesses whether there is sufficient evidence to proceed. This standard is probable cause. Furthermore, proceedings are secret, and a specified quorum must be present to vote on issuing the indictment. Building directly on the structure, let us examine the specific mechanics governing grand jury proceedings, particularly as they relate to Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 6. The most critical feature is the strict secrecy requirement codified in Rule 6e. This rule mandates that grand jurors, attorneys for the government, the witness testifying, and court reporters are generally the only individuals permitted in the room during testimony and deliberation. Disclosure of matters occurring before the grand jury, except in very limited circumstances, is strictly prohibited. This secrecy is vital for protecting witnesses and preventing suspects from learning the scope of the investigation prematurely. Furthermore, the rules of evidence are significantly relaxed. Unlike a trial, hearsay evidence is routinely admissible before the grand jury. The prosecutor maintains substantial control over the presentation of evidence. They decide what evidence to present and what exculpatory evidence, if any, must be presented. The panel votes based solely on the evidence presented to them, reinforcing the prosecutor's influential role in securing an indictment. The grand jury's deliberation concludes in one of two ways. If the panel finds sufficient evidence, they issue a true bill, which formally becomes the indictment. If probable cause is lacking, they return a no bill, effectively terminating the federal prosecution for that specific offense. In federal felony cases, the indictment is the required charging instrument. However, the defendant can waive the right to a grand jury indictment, leading to the filing of an information instead. Furthermore, many state systems bypass the grand jury entirely for felonies, relying solely on the information, often following a preliminary hearing. This charging document, whether an indictment or an information, is absolutely fundamental. It serves as the official notice to the defendant of the charges they must defend against and is crucial for establishing the trial court's jurisdiction over the matter and defining the precise scope of the charges the prosecution can pursue at trial. We have established how the charging document, the indictment or information, is finalized. This document officially signals the end of the investigative phase and propels us into the defendant's initial interaction with the judicial system. Following the issuance of the charging instrument, the defendant must be brought before a magistrate or judge for their initial appearance. This appearance is critical because it sets the stage for the arraignment, where the charges are formally read and the defendant enters a plea. It is important to remember that in jurisdictions utilizing the preliminary hearing instead of a grand jury, that hearing serves the same function, a judicial determination of probable cause before the information is filed. Now, let us examine what happens at this crucial first appearance and the subsequent arraignment. Having navigated the initial appearance, we now focus specifically on the arraignment, governed by Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 10. This is the formal proceeding where the defendant is officially notified of the charges against them. The judge or magistrate reads aloud the charging document, either the indictment returned by the grand jury or the information filed by the prosecutor. Following this reading, the defendant must enter a plea. There are three primary responses. First, a plea of not guilty, which preserves all constitutional defenses and sets the case for trial. Second, a plea of guilty, which waives most subsequent rights and moves directly toward sentencing. Third, the plea of nolo contendere, meaning no contest. This plea has the same effect as a guilty plea for sentencing purposes in the current case, but generally cannot be used as an admission of guilt in subsequent civil proceedings. It is crucial to note that at the arraignment, the defendant has the fundamental right to counsel, as established in Gideon v. Wainwright. If the defendant cannot afford an attorney, one must be appointed before the plea is accepted. Now that the defendant has formally entered a plea following the arraignment, the next critical determination involves their custody status pending trial, the setting of bail. This process is fundamentally governed by the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution, which states that excessive bail shall not be required. However, this language often causes confusion. It is vital to understand that the Eighth Amendment does not guarantee a right to bail in all cases. It only prohibits the imposition of bail that is excessively high if bail is granted at all. The decision to release or detain the defendant, and under what conditions, serves two primary, often competing, objectives. First, the court must ensure the defendant's appearance at future proceedings, addressing the risk of flight. Second, and increasingly important, the court must protect the safety of the community from the defendant during the pre-trial period. Building directly from the previous discussion on flight risk and community safety, we now examine the practical mechanisms courts use to manage pre-trial status. Release can take several forms. The least restrictive is release on recognizance, or ROR, where the defendant promises to appear without posting money. A more common method is cash bail, requiring the defendant or a third party to post the full amount, which is returned if the defendant appears. Alternatively, a surety bond involves a bail bondsman posting a percentage of the bond amount, usually for a non-refundable fee paid by the defendant. However, when the risk of flight or danger is deemed too high, detention may be ordered. This brings us to the landmark Supreme Court case, United States v. Salerno. Salerno upheld the constitutionality of the Bail Reform Act of 1984, permitting preventative detention based solely on a finding of future dangerousness, provided strict procedural safeguards are in place. When setting conditions, judges weigh several factors: the nature and circumstances of the offense, the weight of the evidence, the defendant's history and characteristics, and critically, the risk of non-appearance or danger to the community. We have now navigated the critical initial hurdles of the criminal process following the filing of charges. Recall the sequence. First, the grand jury decides whether sufficient evidence exists to issue an indictment. moving the case forward. Second, at the arraignment, the defendant formally enters a plea, establishing the initial posture of the defense. Third, the bail determination sets the defendant's custody status pending trial, balancing liberty against community safety and appearance risk. Successfully clearing these procedural gates, the indictment, the plea, and the bail decision, is essential. Once these foundational elements are settled, the case transitions directly into the next major phase of litigation, the extensive process of discovery and the filing of pre-trial motions, which we will explore next.